Good afternoon, everyone. If you will please take a seat so we can get started. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Marina Sereni. I'm the Italian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor for me to introduce and chair this session together with Mr. Patton. I also warmly welcome our distinguished speakers. I would also like to express my gratitude to the Fondazione Scienze Religiose Giovanni XXIII and its secretary, Professor Melloni, and all the people who have worked hard in the organization of this initiative. I am particularly glad that the role of the Interfaith Forum is gaining ground year after year since its first edition in 2014. We strongly believe that the religious perspective has the potential to help us face the most pressing challenges of our times. In this session, I expect we will discuss the way in which religions and religious engagement could be a critical factor in conflict prevention and resolution. Addressing conflicts, it is a very hard task. The outbreaks of hate and violence that affected many areas of the world are often just the symptoms. The real causes of the conflict disease are often rooted in social and economic inequalities, poverty, lack of access in education, and violations of basic human rights. Moreover, such disease can rapidly spread and wreak havoc throughout communities and societies of neighbor countries, dissolving years-long efforts for peace and stability in just a few days. We cannot stand passive in front of the tragic situation of countries and regions in the world affected by conflicts. We cannot ignore such situations, not only because of the urge to act arising from a common moral code, but also because our own societies are not immune from the transnational effects of such disease. As the dramatic situation in Afghanistan clearly shows us, indifference is not a sustainable option. And another relevant lesson learned from that experience revolves around the limits of military solutions. In this framework, religious engagement can provide a decisive support for healing people's wounds and reduce distances within communities. The contribution of religions to the prevention of conflicts is significant under many aspects. Religions provide people with an important support, both spiritually and materially. This support is potentially capable of avoiding the escalation of violence and enhancing reconciliation among opposite parties, especially when conflicts are fought along ethno-religious lines. The engagement of religious leadership from both sides is critical. Interfaith dialogue can become the enabling factor for reaching a negotiated settlement. Indeed, mediation during conflicts could represent one of the most operative and visible results of interfaith dialogue and religious engagement. However, the important role of religious communities is often much deeper and less visible. The economic crisis induced by the COVID-19 pandemics, but also some long-term consequences of the 2008 Great Recession, have left deep scars in the social fabric of our societies. Religious communities thoroughly and patiently heal these scars. providing support to the most vulnerable sectors of our societies. In Italy, the activities carried out by what we call the third sector, a term we use for distinguishing it from the public and the private ones, has always proven to be priceless. Religious organizations are an active part of the third sector, and within such field, they take care of the elders, people with disabilities, the poorest, and other people often invisible to the broad society. A similar role is played by other religious organizations in many other countries. Religious organizations count on strong social networks, often at the very local level. This particular feature can represent a valuable asset for states struggling to provide social services to growing populations distributed over large territories. From a more interreligious perspective, we are confident that the efforts for dialogue and comprehension exemplified by the works of this forum can be successful. We indeed perceive that there are some values and principles felt in the same way by all religions. The concept of the sanctity of the human being is at the core of this universally acknowledged ethic. Starting from this common set of values, it is possible to build a new positive narrative. Religions have often been regarded as a source of clash among cultures and even as a cause of conflicts. However, on the contrary, if positively engaged, religious actors are at every level are capable of rebuilding even the most torn apart community. Thanks to their moral authority, religious leaders can result much more effective in spreading a message of peace and mutual comprehension, a message not confined only within their original religious community, but often recognized also outside. Therefore, it would be an unforgivable omission for the political authorities not to properly consider the role of religious engagement in conflict prevention. Religious leaders are endowed with a unique outreach capacity, often unknown to the public authority. Their active involvement could also make a difference in many major campaigns against social plagues, such as, just to mention a sad example, female genital mutilations. There is a close connection between cultural diversity, interreligious dialogue, and social harmony. When people of different faiths do not relate to each other, alienation and indifference could turn into hate, persecution, discrimination, marginalization, and intolerance. The result of this tragic, vicious circle is an impoverished and weakened society. Let me conclude by pointing out to the relevance of places of worship. As we have tragically observed, places of worship can become the preferred targets for hostile actions aimed at spreading hate and inciting violence. Especially in context of conflicts, such ruthless attacks are designed to alter the nature of conflicts and exacerbate tensions. Managing such vulnerability could be troublesome, since protection and security must be balanced with the rights to worship. In this framework, Italy could put at the disposal of civil and religious counterparts its valuable experience in the field of protection of cultural heritage, building on existing initiatives, such as the United Nations Plan of Action to Safeguard Religious Sites, launched by the Alliance of Civilizations in 2019. We believe there is a wide potential for cooperation among international institutions, national states, and religious communities with a view to increasing awareness and commitment on the need to strengthen the protection of places of worship around the world. Italy looks forward to capitalizing on the positive experience of this year G20 Interfaith Forum by providing new platforms to foster dialogue and cooperation between civil and religious actors in the framework of a common search for effective and durable solutions to today's most pressing challenges. Thanking you all for your attention. Let me give the floor to Mr. James Patton, President and CEO of the International Center for Religions and Diplomacy, which has the floor. Please, James.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Vice Minister Sereni. There are so many important points that you hit. And I also want to just reiterate our gratitude to our Italian hosts, especially Professor Maloney, as well as the organizers, not only Cole Durham from Brigham Young and Catherine Marshall from Georgetown, but the phalanx of people behind the scenes who have been struggling to get this all to happen and bring us all together after a long time of not seeing some of my colleagues abroad. It's really nice to be here. In March 2020, just a few days after we closed our office, and I know many of you did as well because of the pandemic, the UN Secretary General Guterres issued a call for a global ceasefire. And the subtitle of this event is the Unheard Call for a Global Ceasefire. And despite the fact that the UN acted on this, that there was a resolution that such luminaries as Pope Francis and others called on their adherents to try to fulfill the global ceasefire, there was very little, if any, real impact of this. And so the question is, what is the impact? What's the point of a global ceasefire? So I'm just going to share some statistics fairly quickly, hopefully, so we can get to some of our illustrious speakers. But armed conflicts, according to Relief Web, remained fairly steady from 2019 to 2020. But inside that number, the number of what they call high intensity armed conflicts actually increased significantly. Now, we all know some of the high profile issues and conflicts that we've been looking at. 11 million people are displaced internally and externally in Syria, for example. 11 million people. 85,000 human beings have lost their lives in Yemen just from famine. Not even talking about cholera or the violence itself, right? 100,000 civilians killed in Afghanistan in the last decade. Between 650 and 2.4 million, and we don't even know, that's a wide range, have been killed in Iraq. 750,000 people pushed out of their homes in Myanmar. Ethiopia, until recently, was a case study for intergroup harmony. And now, of course, we all know what's happening in Tigray and the violence there. One hospital alone in Mogadishu reports 60,000 victims in one hospital of al-Shabaab's violence. And there are many more examples that, honestly, the media and policymakers have forgotten. The Kurdish region in Turkey, tribal violence and political violence in Libya, the Ukraine, where there is still resistance, Thailand, where there is civil unrest, drug wars in Mexico, the peace accord in Colombia that is coming apart, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Even the youngest nation in the world, South Sudan, is still unstable. And we could go on, right? So what is the impact of a global ceasefire in terms of lives and displacement? But it's not just lives and displacement. We talk about economics as well. While there is a 40% increase in the need for humanitarian assistance, according to UN OCHA, between 2020 and 2021, 3% of the global population needs humanitarian assistance. The World Bank says that between 5 and 70 billion a year can be saved if conflicts are diminished. World Economic Forum includes military spending and other kinds of conflict like crime. They say $14 trillion a year are lost because of conflict. $14 trillion, which is roughly $5 per person per day in a world where 10% of our fellow humans live on less than $2 a day. right? With economic losses from armed conflict in 2018 listed at 742 billion by the forum. They report that at the same time, UN peacekeeping, despite doubling over the decade, represents barely 1% of that cost. So these are the costs. The cost of violence is 13.3% of the global GDP, and 0.7% is committed as official development assistance. So our investment in war and violence is transcendently higher than our investment in the desperate need that people have to be helped, you know, humanitarian assistance, other kinds of interventions. 4.5 million people are dead from COVID globally. And of course, COVID was one of the reasons that the ceasefire was initiated, or the call for the ceasefire. The GDP globally is losing $375 billion every month. So the benefits of a global ceasefire are evident. It's very clear what could be recovered from reducing violence, but we also know that there are huge economic incentives, both at the government level and within groups of mercenaries or within the arms sales industry, to keep conflict alive, right? So my question to our illustrious panelists who will join us now to speak, and you have all of their bios in the materials, so I will just introduce them one at a time by name, but please look into the work that they've done. It's really a very impressive group. Is if 84% of the global population ascribes to a religious tradition, as Pew has told us, and we all have cited a million times, I'm sure, in this crowd, if that number of people, north of 6 billion human beings, are religious, what is the role? What can be the influence of the religious communities, particularly now where I think religious communities are suffering internal divisions between the groups who wish to care for the other based on their understanding of the divine, and the groups that wish to exclude and even persecute the other based on their understanding of the divine? How can faith actually support the massive transformation that we're trying to talk about here in terms of a global ceasefire? So let me turn to our panelists, please, and I will pass the microphone first to, I got to get the order right here because I was told to do this in a different order than I had anticipated, but Ambassador Stefano Ronca, and please, again, look into the bios of our panelists, because we don't have a terrible amount of time. We'd like to get to some question and answers. So I will just invite the ambassador to come and share his views. Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim. May I just add to your very effective presentation, just to remind that 100 years ago, 9 out of 10 people in war were military. Now, 9 out of 10 victims in conflicts are civilians. We should not forget that. And thank you very much, Vice Minister, for your comprehensive intervention, in which you evoked the crucial aspects which make religion and religious actors instrumental in foreign affairs, and in particular in conflict prevention and conflict resolution. I would try to dwell on some of your points. In particular, the common values shared by different religions as a tool to diffuse tensions, the added value of the religious institutions compared to the secular ones, the women's role in peacekeeping, concluding with consideration on Afghanistan, which seems to be today an inevitable subject. Religions can be ambivalent. They can serve as a source of conflict or a source of conflict resolution. Both religions, peacekeepers, and religious suicide bombers refer to the same scriptures. Too often, religion is manipulated to justify conflicts which have other origins, usually related to power and economy. But according to some scholars, human relations are rather based on reciprocity. Mimetic rivalry can spiralize into violence and create a vicious circle. A trivial insult can start a fight where people die. Religious values like forgiveness, mercy, and understanding can play a crucial role in peacekeeping. Many today affirm that modern societies are becoming more and more secular, that religion is retreating. But a Pew study says that in 2050, Muslims will equal Christians and that 10% of Europe will adhere to Islam. As you pointed out, Jim, with 84% of people of the world belonging to some religions, it is not understandable that many foreign ministries are setting up in many countries special units dealing with religion and foreign policy. Religion and religious actors can play a constructive role in diplomacy, introducing concepts belonging to the spiritual and ethic sphere rather than to the political or legal one. Mercy, love, generosity, hospitality, forgiveness, but also prudence, dealing with new areas of technology like cyber tools or autonomous and intelligent weapons. Humility, which should govern our approach to NATO, and even gradualness, to allow more steps in order to induce substantial results in difficult negotiations. In peacekeeping and healing post-conflict situation, are religious actors different from secular actors? Moral and spiritual leverages are unavailable to secular actors. Religious actors are concerned with the well-being of the soul as well as of the body. Secular actors are more concentrated on material support. Healing of painful memories of a conflict can be a major component of peacebuilding. Forgiveness and reconciliation can liberate both the victims and the perpetrators of violence. The Hutu-Tutsi massacres in Rwanda has several examples of this. The case of Marcel Wineza, cited by Christine Schlisser in her book on Religions in Conflict, is very moving. Marcel tells that when the man who killed his parents asked him forgiveness and he forgave him, Marcel, the son of the victims, felt free and realized that forgiveness heals the forgiver even more than the forgiven. Religious institutions are extremely well organized. They can reach out a large number of people throughout their churches, mosques, prayers, and sermons. Especially in developing countries, they can be instrumental in critical situations to connect actors who need to talk. Personally, I had a few experiences of this when I was an Italian diplomat and crisis manager of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Rome, dealing with a few kidnappings of our nationals in Africa and the Middle East. Religious orders in the regions, particularly components, were fundamentally providing information and contacts with the liberation movements and their leadership, and at the end, fundamental for their salvation. Now in Lebanon, in our structures of the Order of Malta, take place meetings of factions in our ambulances and hospitals. At the Aventine, which is our home in Rome, confidential meetings of high-level political and religious representatives belonging to different parties and faith took place to look for common solution to their problem. But what makes the contribution of religious leaders and FBOs significant in peacekeeping? Well, first of all, they can easily prove that they have no political agenda. They accumulate great credibility for their spiritual and humanitarian action. For the Order of Malta, this is quite evident. The activity we carry out with our hospital dispensaries, elderly and disabled facilities, migration camps, interreligious dialogue, inspire confidence to the public in the region. Moreover, they carry out a wide spectrum of humanitarian activities, wider compared to that of secular organization. According to a study by Highest and None, religious institutions cover an average of 4.2 types of assistance, compared to 2.6 types covered by secular organizations. And after an earthquake, everybody knows that religion actors stay after TV crews and journalists have gone. Now, how can we improve the potential of religious actors? Well, first of all, with a better use of media to publicize the action of the FBOs. Secondly, enhancing the interaction of religious actors with politicians, diplomats, private sector, NGOs. Public institutions still underestimate the value and the importance of FBOs. Then, with a better inclusion of youth, young leaders can be powerful in mobilizing energies in society. Think of Greta Thunberg and Malala in the field of environment and human rights. And then more women. Women are effective in conflict resolutions because they can diffuse aggressiveness better than men. I was fascinated reading about an organization, organization of Muslim ladies called PAIMAN, established by a woman called Montserrat Kadem. These ladies work with mothers to de-radicalize young extremists. The group was created after an attack in 2014, where 148 children were killed in a Peshawar school by a Taliban group called Tehrik, which claimed the attack afterwards. PAIMAN has developed a strategy of diffusing conflicts and promoting peace using sacred texts. They communicate with other women, often negatively influenced by their male relatives. And the result is now 24,000 women reached out and 1,400 young extremists de-radicalized. Another example is that the group of women leaders in Nigeria. I learned this by a very inspiring lecture by Jim Patton, where two men, Christians and Muslims, leading two rival groups. James, one was Imam Ashafa, and the other was Pastor James, who had done the most incredible, terrible things to each other, at the end are today working together to the same objective, which is peacekeeping. Now, the last point, the dialogue with extremists. The action plan to prevent violence wanted by Secretary General Gutierrez in 2018, drafted with 230 religious leaders belonging, I think, to 77 countries, says at page 10 that we should engage in dialogue with those with political or religious extremist views and counter their arguments using religious texts. I believe that religious actors should be part of a comprehensive approach in engaging Taliban rulers, because the Taliban in Kabul are at the same time religious and political actors. But if a dialogue is established with the Taliban, it might be advisable to avoid the terminology and the concepts of Western liberal values. In the area of human rights, for instance, it would be preferable to use a religious language and emphasize the human rights, the religious origin of several standards which define human rights in the secular world. Human rights, in fact, would probably evoke in their minds Western values to reject as something belonging to the West. The role of religious actors can be crucial today in Kabul. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. You pointed out a couple of value add pieces with respect to religious engagement. I just want to highlight. One of the things you said is long-term engagement. This is one of the assets that religious communities have. They stay, they're there for generations. And so to be able to engage with them is to be able to connect long-term with the communities. The other that you highlighted, which I think is very important, is the engagement with women of faith. ICRD, my organization, is doing right now with the U.S. Institute of Peace an evaluation of women of faith mediators around the world and their role. We know that many mainstream traditions, however, are very exclusive when it comes to official positions of power for women. And so what's very important as we advocate perhaps for that change is also to identify locally where these women do have influence. Women like Monserrat and Paiman and others. So thank you for bringing up both of those points. Now I'd like to turn please to Dr. Judd Birdsall, my friend from Georgetown University. If you'd come up, Judd, thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Deputy Minister and James, for co-chairing today's panel. It's an honor to be here in Bologna at the G20 Interfaith Forum, and a special honor to be on this panel with some of the leading experts in the field of religion and peace building. I serve as the director of an organization called the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy. That's a mouthful, so we call it the TPNRD, sometimes referred to as the TIPNERD. So I lead the TIPNERD organization, which is a forum of diplomats in Europe and North America who collaborate on issues at the intersection of faith and foreign policy. And as a project, it's based at Georgetown University in their Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. We actually had a panel discussion on the TPNRD at the G20 Interfaith Forum in Tokyo in 2019. And there are several of us from the TPNRD here in Bologna this time, and a few in this room as well. The network was launched in Florence, and we've met a couple of times, several times actually, in Italy. Italy has been an enormously important country for the life of our network, and I think that's a small illustration of the influence and impact that Italy has more broadly in the field of religion and international affairs, religion and law, freedom of religion or belief, and on our topic today of religion and peace building. As it relates to religion and peace building, I wanted to just share three quick reflections from my vantage point, which is not one as an expert or practitioner in religion and peace building, but more of a religion and world affairs generalist, if you will. I previously served at the State Department, and now in my role with the TPNRD, I manage a website called religionanddiplomacy.org. So always looking for resources on that general topic that are of interest to our diplomatic participants. So three quick reflections from that vantage point. First, there's a lot of good news on religion and conflict, as strange as that may seem. Second, a lot of the new research on religion and peace building has given us a much more refined understanding of the role that religion plays in world affairs more generally, and especially, of course, within violent conflicts and in the process of peace building. And third, there's been some good fresh work done on this whole challenge of instrumentalizing religion. So first, the good news on religion and conflict. The bad news, of course, is obvious, and James recounted a number of active conflicts in the world, many of which have a religious dimension. Overall, in recent decades, the number of armed conflicts has gone down, thankfully, but we've seen an increase in the number of conflicts with a religious dimension, particularly conflicts where the issues at stake, the issues that each side is fighting over are framed in religious terms. And has been alluded to already and many times during this conference, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated a number of these conflicts and social tensions where religion is a key factor. And that comes on top of several years of this rising religious nationalism and religious populism that exploits religious differences. But the good news is that religious actors are increasingly involved in peace-building work at the senior-most levels. James referred to Pope Francis's call, or its contribution to the call for a global ceasefire is one example, and also at the grassroots level. A great deal of activity taking place within faith-based organizations committed to peace. And then in recent years, a dramatic increase in the number of governmental and multilateral and academic and NGO initiatives focused on religion and peace building. And our panel here is a testament to that with Sant'Egidio and KAICIID, ICRD, the Network of Religious and Traditional Peacemakers, my center at Georgetown. So many centers have popped up in recent years. And there are many more that I'm sure I'm not aware of doing good work in this field around the world. That gives me a bit of encouragement that you've got so many good people bringing their creativity and their energy and their values to this work. And there are so many more resources on this topic than there used to be, reports and trainings and toolkits and so on. Second, all of this activity, this energy, this reflection on religion and peace building has given us all a much more refined understanding of the role of religion in world affairs, including in conflict. So we can't just talk about conflicts being simply or purely religious or secular, but we are encouraged and have the tools to look in a more refined way at all the different complex ways religious identities and imaginations and values and institutions can become factors in escalating and framing conflicts or in reframing and de-escalating conflicts. Within the TPNRD, we talk a lot about the need to right-size religion. That is to have an appropriately nuanced understanding of religion in any given context, and then using that understanding to inform our engagement with religious actors. Third, that engagement with religious actors brings me to a final point on instrumentalizing religion. At these sorts of conferences where we have politicians, government officials, alongside religious leaders and academics, one often hears this concern about instrumentalizing religion, that is, using or misusing religion for political ends. I've found that as the field of religion and peace building has matured, there's been some fresh thinking on this issue. And I would particularly commend a report from the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich that came out last year entitled The Instrumentalization of Religion in Conflicts. Excellent report. And I did an interview with the author, and we posted that at religionanddiplomacy.org if you're interested in taking a look. But one of the key messages in their report was that this charge, this accusation of instrumentalization typically rests on Enlightenment assumptions about the divisibility of religion and politics. But we know that even in places where you have an institutional separation of church and state, religion and politics are intertwined and meshed with each other in all sorts of complex ways. It's impossible to fully separate them. And second, the charge of instrumentalization is most often not simply a description, it's an accusation, it's a judgment, and often it serves to end conversations rather than prompt further conversation and further research. It should, if we see instrumentalization taking place, it should prompt us to look deeper into why it's taking place and what effect it may have that helps us understand better what's going on in a given context. And the field of religion and peace building has shown us, and I think the G20 Interfaith Forum is a testament that there can be all sorts of productive, mutually beneficial, mutually respectful partnerships between government entities and faith-based organizations and religious groups and so on. I think the key thing is ongoing dialogue and respect for each side's equities and integrity so that neither side feels used or instrumentalized. So to conclude, even though there's lots of bad news about religion and conflict around the world that we're all aware of and troubled by, I'm still encouraged by the growth and maturity of the field. And I commend my colleagues who are on this panel who are out in the field, literally doing this sort of work. I commend you for it, and thank you for the insights that you've given all of us. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Judd. And I think you're pointing to the tension between the increased engagement with religion, which we've seen an enormous change. Governments and others really focused on this. I remember Dr. Douglas Johnston's book 27 years ago called Religion, the Missing Dimension of Statecraft, where he was kind of calling into the wilderness along with some of our esteemed colleagues like Dr. Abu-Nimer here, asking people to think about this in a realpolitik world. And now it's an entirely different space. But to be able to do that while not at the same time trying to manipulate religion for political ends is so critically important. And I don't know how many times we've had the debate that religious actors are not just for religious conflict. They're in the world, they're in people's lives, and they can be partners in transforming all sorts of different kinds of conflicts. So thank you for pointing that out. Now, I believe that we have a representative calling in from the Embassy of China here in Italy. Now is the time, I believe, to give the floor to Professor Yihua Xu.
Well, can you see me or? Oh, no. Can you see me or hear from me?
We can hear from you, sir.
Okay, good. Good. Thank you, Deputy Minister, and thank you, Mr. Chairperson. Well, this is Xu Yihua. I'm a professor in the Department of International Politics at Fudan University, which is located in Shanghai, China. My little talk is about the role of religion in eliminating international conflicts and promoting world peace. Well, I will focus on academic discussions in China in general, not as specific as other speakers in the panel. The Chinese government always maintained that the peace and the development are the two major themes of a contemporary world. But in order to achieve these two goals, the international community is called upon to eliminate international conflicts on the negative side and promote dialogue and understanding among different civilizations and countries on the positive side. Religion plays both negative and positive roles in society. As we all know that religion can be the most authentic expression of the highest ideal of the humankind, but it can also be used, as the gentleman mentioned, even weaponized by extremists and terrorists. In short, it can be both a peacemaker and a troublemaker. Therefore, maximizing the positive effects of religion while minimizing the negative effects are crucial in our efforts to maintain world peace. Religion used to be regarded more as a problem than a solution in our country, in China. Since China's reform and opening up some 40 years ago, the positive effects of religion in society have been duly recognized and appreciated, especially in the academic circle by scholars. In regard to the positive role of religion in the international arena, the views of the Chinese researchers can be summarized as the following 5 approaches. First, religion is regarded as a vehicle or actor of cultural exchange between China and foreign countries. The previous sensitive subjects like Christian missionary movement in China has been re-evaluated within this framework. And the contributions of Western missionaries to the modernization process of China has received a more balanced and a positive examination, which really relaxed the grip of narrow and nationalistic views on the study of religion, making it a legitimate and indispensable part of academic studies in China today. Actually, the cultural exchange in which religion is an important part is viewed as the third pillar of China's current external relations. The other two, of course, is the economy and the politics. And China has established a number of high-level cultural exchange mechanisms with quite a few countries in the world. Of course, religion is an important part of it. Second approach, religion as a channel for public diplomacy. In the previous 2 decades, religious factor has been integrated into the study of public diplomacy, and the so-called religious public diplomacy is considered as part of China's soft power. Currently, both concepts of public diplomacy and soft power have come under critical reflection. In the views of some Chinese scholars, that soft power is still a form of power, just as public diplomacy is a tool of foreign policy. They argue that Chinese external religious exchange should not bear too much the burden of diplomacy of any form. Another similar concept is definitely the faith-based diplomacy, which is also proposed and elaborated by Western scholars, mainly American scholars, and described as President Patton mentioned, the missing dimension of the statecraft. Religion is not the mainstream ideology or ideology in China. Therefore, the discussion, all these discussions about faith-based diplomacy only have theoretical implications. Third approach, religion as a platform for cross-cultural dialogue. In today's world, I think everybody agrees that dialogue is an effective or feasible means for different civilizations and countries, nationalities, and religions to solve the problems, disputes, and conflicts among them. And religious dialogue is a very hot subject, not only for academic studies, not only in China, but in other places as well. The constructive role of religious dialogue is described in this country as tearing down walls and building up bridges among religions and between religion and larger society. And the Chinese religious organizations and scholars are becoming more and more involved in the international religious dialogue, both as participants and sometimes as organizers. Fourth approach, religion as a factor in China's efforts to build a community of shared future for mankind. Building a community of shared future for mankind is a concept of international relations and a formula of global governance proposed and advocated by Chinese government in recent years. It's not a slogan, it's based on the vision of or principle of taking into consideration or taking care of the legitimate concerns for other countries when pursuing your own interests and promoting common development of all countries when you seek the development of your own. The international community is depicted in this concept as a big boat, and we need to be in the same boat to weather the storm, to cross the stormy ocean, so to speak. The Chinese scholars believe that unless we have religious tolerance, exchange, understanding, respect, and more importantly, freedom, it will be futile to talk about this vision of building the community of shared future for mankind. Fifth approach, religious factor in China's participation in global governance, including, of course, tackling the global issues like COVID-19 pandemic and environment protection, using religion and religious organizations as resource. In recent years, various concrete programs of global governance are increasingly under the agenda, actually in the meeting room of 5 major religions in China, namely Buddhism, Taoism, Islam, Catholicism, and Protestantism. Global governance issues are divided into several levels, such as individual level, subnational level, national level, regional level, and international level. And religious organizations in China, such as China Committee on Religion and Peace, which is a part of the World Conference on Religion and Peace, are involved in activities and programs of all these levels aforementioned. In conclusion, because of the unremitting efforts of religious practitioners, religious leaders and scholars, religious studies as an academic discipline has been rehabilitated and revived in China. And the scope of its investigation has reached out to the realm of religion and international relations, especially the religious factor in Chinese foreign policy and external relations. This is understandable in view of the fact that China is now the second largest economy and the largest trading country in the world. And China has to pay adequate attention to the so-called faith world and treat religious matters, both domestic and international, very, very seriously. I think the topic of this panel, Healing the Conflicts, the unheard appeal to global ceasefire, is quite compatible with the goals of the Chinese religious organizations in global governance. Actually, it's quite compatible with China's foreign policy. I can not speak for other institute on this side, but my institute, I mean the Center for the Study of Religion and International Relations at Fudan University, would like to endorse any initiative for global ceasefire if there's such a move from this panel or from this G20 interface forum. As we may know that among the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, China has the largest number of peacekeeping troops stationed in different parts of the world. We can anticipate a more active role of Chinese religious organizations on international stage, providing the international community with more public goods and wisdoms drawing from the religious traditions in China, as well as in other countries. At least I hope that could be the case in the future. Thank you. This is the end of my speech.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shu Yihua. And while I invite Dr. Mohammed Elsanousi to come to the lectern, I'd just like to say, I think that it is really good to hear a voice from China about China's transition in terms of its engagement with religion, religious actors. I personally would love to read more of your work, but most of what I found online from you, Dr. Yihua, was in Chinese, and my Chinese is non-existent. So if you do have English language publications, please feel free to send them along, because I think this is a very important and fascinating topic for many of us here. So Dr. Elsanousi, please come to the lectern.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you, James and Deputy Minister, and thank you to the organizers for having us here. So far, we enjoyed our time here in Bologna, and we're looking forward to also walk in the city this afternoon as well. But let me begin by saying that, James, because of the interest of time, in my short 7 to 10 minutes, I'm going to address 3 issues. One is related to what role religious actors could play in terms of contextual theology, the interpretation of text in their role, as well as how they can be as a preventive measures, adopt preventive measures. And lastly, the importance of inclusion and inclusivity in the involvement of religious leaders. The question here before us is that how we can ensure religion does not play a role in perpetuating these conflicts, rather serve as a guiding mechanism to support sustainable peace, and how we can ensure to include groups who must always be at the table, but often are left behind, such as youth. First, when we look into how our fellow religionists can support sustainable peace, we need to look at the theology we are using. And that's where I'm going to bring the contextual theology and how we can allow religious actors to interpret their text based on their local theology. Theology that can be applied to a broad range of issues, especially in regards to peace and conflict. It is important for religious leaders and actors to have a safe space to discuss these topics. Safe spaces allow communities to discuss balanced contextual theology and religious interpretations. Balanced contextual theology relates to a theology that takes into consideration local customs, culture, traditions. And that's where local communities need to be vigilant and not accept any theology that does not synchronize with their local context and culture. This is happening. We see communities are suffering because other theologies coming to their borders and to their countries that are not really fitting that context and trying to force them. It's not going to work. Let's have people interpret their own theology. Now, We also want to, in addition to that, I want to just emphasize that we need to emphasize the importance of the multilateral and multi-faith and multi-leaders and government in supporting and facilitating peace-building mechanisms rather than serving as implementers. So here, I know the multilateral institutions and government trying to help, but let's provide the opportunity for local mechanisms and instruments that already exist, led by religious leaders, and we know they are working. We must emphasize the importance of the local communities in all of our work. International instruments do not always address the root causes of conflicts and the context in which they arise. The only way that we can truly understand conflicts is through engagement of local actors, religious actors who are embedded in local context and are in an ideal position to support resolutions, such as religious and traditional actors. And James, you already mentioned the Secretary General call for ceasefire earlier. What we have done to actualize that ceasefire, we had roundtable discussions for religious actors from South Sudan, and also we did with religious actors from Myanmar as well, just to see how they can actualize the call by the SG. Now, my second point is preventive measures are very critical for all of us when looking to support peaceful and cohesive societies. Again, in August in 2021, the United Nations Secretary General issued a call to support victims of religion, of religious-based violence, specifically in regard to the rising intolerance. The COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, has fueled racism, stigma, and discrimination, often targeting ethnic and religious minorities, has further, increased and also reduced the social cohesion. As a result of the rise of hate speech and misinformation, we as the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemaker, and with the support by the EU, we put together a consortia project titled Awareness with Human Action. This project supports religious actors, women and youth in reducing hate speech and misinformation while simultaneously educating local communities on the pandemic. The initiative is working toward strengthening human solidarity during this global crisis. I'm always fascinated by this project because the project was able to empower 50 individuals, youth, and organizations in South and Southeast Asia to receive a small grant to implement work in their own communities. So again, for the sake of sustainability. My last point here, the inclusivity, and I want to spend the rest of my couple of minutes on this one. I want to emphasize that the process to involve religion and religious actors will not be effective if inclusion is not integrated into peace-building approaches. It is critical for all entities to adopt, leave no one behind, an integral universal value designated by the United Nations. In universally adopting leave no one behind, we can curb inequalities and confront discrimination. We can ensure that we respect different religious affiliations, orientations, genders, sexuality, and age, allowing us to bring everyone to the table for open and inclusive dialogue. The Women in the Frontline program that in South Sudan, this is a program that the network participated with the Office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, the program was an opportunity to engage the wives of all the bishops of South Sudan, as well as their husbands. It focused on key areas of peace and conflict. So basically, the bishops were meeting, but what role their wives could play. So we want to engage them. And I also want to mention another example for the, the inclusion and the role of women in particular. When the Holy Father visited Central African Republic, there was someone mediated between the anti-Balaka and Salika for a ceasefire for 24 hours so that the Holy Father can have a safe visit. It was behind the scene woman mediators. No one knows the woman, but she did it. The Holy Father was able to travel to the Central Mosque, to BK5, and to announce to the world that faith over fear. Also, we all know that United Nations and other troops they advised him not to go to the Central Mosque, to the PK5, but he went. But the point, the woman mediator, insider mediator, was able to mediate the ceasefire. So that role really needs to be lifted up, and the role of women. And finally, the point I want to really emphasize above all is that everything I have mentioned will not and cannot be successful without the inclusion and meaningful participation of youth. Youth are the backbone to create peaceful societies and must be included from the onset of any peace building processes. The unfortunate reality is that religious actors and institutions are aging institutions. We know that. Our interreligious institutions are aging. Youth are the backbone, as I mentioned earlier. We must not underestimate the importance of engagement and collaboration with religiously motivated youth. We need to stop viewing youth as the future and realize their present contribution. On Saturday and Sunday here in Bologna, as you know, the network partnered. We had the honor to partner with many partners, including KAICIID, Professor Abu-Nimer here, to support and participate in the G20 Interfaith Youth Forum. I think some of the youth are in this actually audience here. For those of you that may not be aware, the G20 Interfaith Youth Forum brought together 50 youth from 30 countries representing 13 different faith traditions to create spaces for youth, interfaith participation, and practitioners to come together to share ideas, experiences, and opportunities to engage in promoting peace, understanding, and solidarity among diverse faiths. When I walked into that room, in that hotel, Royal Carlton Hotel, I was inspired to see passionate, motivated, and energized individuals who are determined to bring dialogue and peace in their communities and around the world. I know we all recognize the importance of youth inclusion, but I wanted you to take the moment to really reflect on your programming and engagement with youth. Youth are sitting here at this forum today, at the G20 Interfaith Forum, eager to learn and raise their voices on issues directly affecting them and their communities. So I want to ask you all here, including myself, have you spoken with a youth representative during this forum? Have you actively listened to their issues or causes? Have you internalized and committed to supporting their efforts? If the answer is no to any of the following questions, there is still time here in Bologna left at the forum to engage with youth in attendance. The youth are ready, able, and willing to support and lead in peace building efforts. We at the Network for Religious and Traditional Peacemaker has strategically prioritized strengthening the leadership of women and youth in religious and traditional peacemaking and broader peace-building processes. We ensure inclusivity is mainstreamed in all of our projects and programs. We are committed to ensuring youth are at the table and have the opportunity to advance their capacity to become successful community leaders. I implore to each and every one of you here today to put an emphasis on meaningful youth inclusion and decision-making in every aspect of your work. Youth inclusion is one of the vital keys for supporting and sustaining peaceful and cohesive societies. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Elsanousi. While I invite Dr. Cesare Zucconi from the San Egidio community to the lectern, let me highlight a couple of things. Mohammed, you told me you didn't want to go right after the other Mohammed, so you know that it's on you that you get the last word. But the couple of, obviously you made a very strong and impassioned argument for including youth. I think one of the things we need to realize in conflict work is oftentimes it's a generational thing. You know, the rising of identity conflict comes with each generation. If we don't anticipate that, then we're trying to fix a problem down the line that we could have engaged with earlier on and really highlight the people who understand what's happening in the next generation. But also you pointed out what I call methodological humility. And I think this is really important for international organizations to go in not with the fix, but to go in with skills and capacities to help elevate what exists already, an asset-based approach to engagement with the communities, rather than looking at what's broken, looking at what's working, and be a facilitator for that to be highlighted, elevated, and scaled. So thank you for both of those points. Now I would like to turn to Dr. Zucconi, please.
Thank you. So I'm not able to say last but not least. So I thank you very much for being invited. The UN Secretary General's strong appeal in March last year for a global ceasefire in the face of the COVID-19 tragedy did not have the desired effect. We know that. The difficulties the appeal went through before being taken up by the Security Council were further evidence of the worrying crisis of multilateralism. But above all, there has been no change of pace at the global level. Those involved in dialogue, mediation, and reconciliation, including many of you participating in this roundtable today, know that there has been no significant reduction in violence, only temporary fixes. You were mentioning it before. Wars have not decreased. Rather, one could say that new conflicts are opening up. I'm thinking particularly about Ethiopia, of the Tigray crisis that is destabilizing the entire region and having a devastating impact on the lives of the Ethiopians. I'm thinking about the current situation in Mozambique, where the jihadist insurgency has created an almost unbelievable number of internally displaced persons, more than 800,000, and 50% of them are children, in a country that after the 1992 peace agreements had experienced almost 30 years of peace, a peace wasted in the lack of governance, corruption, and senseless exploitation of natural resources. Old conflicts are lingering without any solution on the horizon. Some of them were mentioned, not counting those countries where widespread violence linked to criminal association, such as drug cartels or the maras, have taken on the dimensions of real conflicts. I would like to emphasize this point with the words of 'Andrea Riccardi, who said, I quote him, We believed that the world had learned from so many wars and failures. We believed in the enthusiasm of a world of peace after 1989. Instead, there has been a retreat from the achievements of peace and forms of integration between states. There is a tendency to discredit the structures of dialogue that prevent conflict. In this way, the world becomes incapable of preventing war and then lets conflicts fester for years, if not decades, revealing the impotence of the international community. We are convinced of Gutierrez's call to end violence and focus on combating the deadly pandemic. Those who work in conflict resolution and cooperation know how difficult, sometimes impossible, it is to think about development, treatment of diseases, or cooperation in certain situations. Peace is the unavoidable precondition. We see this in South Sudan, where for about 2 years, we as Sant'Egidio have been working to find an agreement between the government in Juba and the political military groups in the country that had not joined the 2018 peace agreement. Or in the Central African Republic, where we are carrying out intense and widespread reconciliation work throughout the country, work that involves armed groups, political parties, and religious communities. Why has this appeal not had the desired effect? There was a different perception of the pandemic in the world. At the beginning, during the first waves, it seemed as if certain parts of the world were spared, as if the virus were a fact mainly linked to developed countries, China, then Europe, then the United States. For many months, there were very few cases in Africa, for example. Today, we know that this is not the case. The devastating impact of COVID-19, particularly in the poorest areas of the planet and on the weakest sectors of the population, has not been contained and has exponentially increased hunger and food insecurity, making access to treatment increasingly difficult. Should we not today think of war as a global disease? Guterres said it clearly, and I quote, "End the sickness of war and fight the disease that is ravaging our world." And war, the Pope says, is not a ghost of the past, but has become a constant threat. It is the present. It risks being the future. I quote these two texts together because I find a great deal of harmony between the Secretary General's call for global ceasefire and the words of Pope Francis, those of the encyclical Fratelli Tutti, and again, those pronounced in a deserted St. Peter's Square on March 2020. Although they start from different points of view and with a different approach, they are words in strong counter-tendency, calling for reflection on the contemporary world and the direction taken by the international community. But we need words that will awaken us from our collective addiction to the logic of conflict. There is a temptation to feel irrelevant and lost in the face of an increasingly complicated and violent world. We felt it clearly in front of the evacuation of thousands of people from Kabul. We have clearly felt the futility of war, but I ask myself along with you, where are those millions of citizens who demonstrated for peace more than 20 years ago before the war in Iraq? A real popular movement for peace is missing. I believe that this is also the role of religions in the world of globalization, from global leaders to local ones. Although the intervening years have witnessed painful events, including conflicts, terrorism, and radicalism, at times in the name of religion, we must also acknowledge the fruitful steps undertaken in the dialogue between religions. Religions have responded with firm clarity to the exploitation of religion for the purpose of violence. The Assisi meetings, a path of 35 years, and its vision of peace, as Pope Francis was saying at the meeting in Rome last year, organized by Sant'Egidio, contain a prophetic seed that has gradually matured through new encounters, acts of peacemaking, and fresh initiatives of fraternity. This is a sign of hope, even if there is still so much to do. In conclusion, never before have we grasped the full meaning of the word globalization, but there is still a lack of widespread awareness of belonging to a single humanity, of being, to quote again Pope Francis, all in the same boat. There is a lack of awareness that each person's evil affects everyone. We are speaking of the war of the others. We used to think that wars were only bad for the countries and peoples who lived through them. But today, millions of refugees traveling against all hope teach us that war affects everyone. And the same we could say about the vaccination campaign reaching mainly the rich countries. But we know we cannot be healthy in a sick world. No people, no social group will be able to achieve peace, good, security, and happiness on its own. No one is saved alone. Fraternity, born of the realization that we are a single human family, must penetrate the life of peoples, communities, government leaders, and international assemblies. In spreading and strengthening this awareness, religions, I'm convinced, can and should play a decisive role. Thank you.
Thank you very kindly, Dr. Zucconi. Now, since we started 10 minutes late, I would beg your patience as we are going to hear from one of the more important colleagues that I have in this space on religion and conflict prevention, Dr. Mohammed Abu-Nimer. A couple of points while you're coming to the lectern that I want to highlight. This question of war as a global disease. I think you also pointed to corruption, maybe the first time we've heard about this, but it's so critically important because corruption, I would say, is a governance disease. And one of the things that most undermines confidence in participatory government and sets back development gains. One point that I want to make, because I'll give the absolute last word to Dr. Abu-Nimer, is we've heard a lot about inclusion today from many of our speakers. I would like to challenge the G20 Interfaith Forum to recognize that of the 8 people who have spoken in this room today, one of them was a woman. So there needs to be a reflection internally here about who is speaking for this field of practice. We have exceptional female colleagues all around the world, one of whom I will quote, Susie Hayward, who we all know, who has gone up to Harvard University, says when you engage the heads of organizations, particularly religious organizations, you end up with a room full of old men in funny hats. So now I don't have a funny hat, nor am I old, but I am part of that group. So we need to reflect on that and be more inclusive in the voices we bring to the table. That said, sir, please.
Thank you. So I'm glad. Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you for staying beyond the extra time. I'm not going to read the speech because I think you'll go to sleep. I'm going to try to wake you up by several points. Thank you, James, for this opportunity to give the bird eye in terms of looking at it from outside. And also thank you for pointing out, you and our colleague speaker before, how bad the cost of war is. But there is two things missing from our analysis. One is the notion of structural violence. We should not continue pointing that the problem is there, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Africa. There is something called structural violence, and that structural violence is also in the north, and it is generated by two systems. One system called racism, and another system called weapon and industry, the weaponization and the industry. Those two systems are generating continuously generating violence as well as cost of war. Again, racism and the weapon industry. We know how the north and from the south compared, who actually produce the weapon and where are these weapons being used. So that's something to keep in mind about this gap between north and south, and the vaccination, as my colleague speaker, the last one, pointed out in terms of the vaccination and where it is. That is something our analysis should take. Now, usually when we meet with the policymakers and religious leader, there's this dance, like we're flirting with each other. And it starts with 4 stages. The first stage, I call it the stage of denial, where policymaker says, no, religion has nothing to do with it, and it's not effective. In fact, religion is irrelevant totally. And then we have many countries at this point who still have not engaged religious leader and who still are struggling in engaging their diplomat in that dance. Those, I call them the policymakers in denial. Now, when you go to meet somebody you're in denial with, that person or that group, in particular the other, they try to be defensive. So here we saw many defensive in this conference and today, where the religious leader or the peace activist try to convince the peacemaker, we are relevant. And here is what we did, 1, 2, 3, 4, and continuously we give evidence and the stories from Sudan, from there, from here. We give stories. Please be convinced that we're relevant. And that is the second stage, and that stage of defensiveness. The third stage in this game, in these conferences and these meetings that I've had 9 years in Europe and all over the world, trying to convince policymakers to engage, trying to convince religious leaders to engage. The third one is to say, you know what, you are relevant, but I'm going to invite you to read Al-Fatiha or to give us your blessing. So we get a religious leader with the funny hat, or with the funny dress, and we have them say Al-Fatiha or some blessing in the beginning or some blessing at the end, and that's what we call symbolic engagement. The symbolic engagement when they're not really that relevant, but you put them here, as we used to do with women in our field as well. We get the one woman and we say, hey, we have one woman. We don't get the one who has the decision making. We don't get the one who has the more, the token minority I'm referring to. The symbolic involvement and engagement is live and kicking in this field. And you can see it in many conferences and in many of our work, especially in policymaker circles, when they want a religious leader. And I always get calls, can you please nominate a Muslim leader who will just say the prayer in the beginning and at the end? That's what we need them for. And we've had some of that even in this conference, missing the Muslim from that part. We move from the symbolic engagement into the what I call compartmentalized engagement. And here the policymakers are convinced, relevant, and you need to do substance. So what do we do with you? We get one person in the foreign ministry and we give her, and that's good because she's a woman, and then you have the gender, and then you have also the compartmentalization. And you say, this person is in charge of engagement with religious leader. That's called compartmentalization, because you get the whole foreign ministry really on one person, 1 or 2 people, European Union, OSCE, African Union, OIC, the Arab League. I can name many, the ASEAN, I can name many of these big organizations, but also regional organizations do the same trick. That's called compartmentalization. You take religion and you put it on the corner. And if somebody said, let's engage with a religious leader, you said room 301, you go to them and they do the engagement. All the other 600 rooms don't deal with religion. Especially in these days, we compartmentalize the engagement with Forbes, with the freedom of religion and belief. And that's a mistake, because what we're looking for is exactly what we look for with race and gender. We're looking for the engagement of religious leader in all part of the policy making, in health, in education, in refugees, in any aspect. Religious leader and religious views, 84% of the population of the world, should not be compartmentalized to room 301 that deals with violent extremism, especially when it deals with Muslim. This is not the way to engage with policy and religious leader. It should be done in a systematic, serious way, and resources should be committed. My colleague Judd and my friend already gave the good stories, so good development in the past 2 decades. I'm skipping that. This was my introduction to say how much progress we have made, but we still, honestly, between the stage of this compartmentalization and symbolic engagement. And that's where we are in this field. You could see here, G20, you could see any conference, what we have, and you could go in any foreign ministry and you ask them who and how you're dealing with religious leader. And you could see how much resources are allocated, how many staff are there, and how many projects are being funded and are being allocated for. I'm hoping, like we were very successful in some agency to engage women, gender, in the implementation of development, where now you have to check the box. Every project have to deal with the gender issue as well. We hope to get to a place where the major donors, the major foreign policy, and the major foreign relation organization will have religion as a pillar that every diplomat has to deal with that. To do this, you have to do religious literacy. How can you engage with a religious leader when you don't know the difference between Shia and Sunni? When you don't know the difference between Catholic and the Protestant? When you don't know the difference of the basic aspect of faith? Not only that, when you yourself as a foreign officer have prejudice deep down against religion, how can you engage with somebody when you have this predisposed position towards them? These are issues of engagement. We deal with them in many other fields, and religion is not an exception. We need this basic literacy, religious literacy, and the tools are there, but we have not yet convinced the foreign ministry to make this mandatory for every diplomat. In the last 3 minutes that I have to...
Vice Minister.
No, I have to go because I have to catch a train, but it is very interesting. Please forgive me.
No problem. I'm just gonna go to the critique of the religious group, but please.
Okay. No. I can stay here.
So on the other side, the story is not better in the religious institution, because when you engage, you need 2 entities. You need also the religious leader to engage. So we go to the religious leader and say, can you please engage with the policymaker? And many of them will say, this is not my job. I am here to preach for Sunday and Monday and Friday or Saturday. You find somebody else to do that. All they will say is very risky. No one will protect me if I engage with the policymaker. 3, most of these religious institutions, the formal, particularly the formal institution, are still dominated by male, as my colleague have said. So we have an issue of inclusion there, and they don't see themselves at that. More important, many of the religious institutions around the world are controlled by the governmental authority. To leave your country, you need a permission from the ministry or from the security to participate in any event outside. So there is an inside problem within this religious institution. One more issue, not religious literacy, we need policy literacy. Most of these religious institutions we deal with have very little literacy in how to engage with policymakers. That's where the capacity building needs to be done. And if you don't believe that, look at us. The G20 today is probably last year when we did it virtually with Saudi Arabia being the host, and now Italy. It's the first time where we have policymakers sit around the table with us. What are we offering? We as a field still struggle in formulating our recommendation. in formulating our tools and techniques, how to convey what we want from the policymakers. So we cannot continue and say the policymakers are not engaging with us. As a field, to be critical of what we do in terms of this engagement, we need the capacity building within these religious institutions. The calls of the Pope is excellent. But again, let's look at below the Pope's institution and other institutions on that level. How much our religious leader on a city, on a regional, on a national level are able and capable of engaging with policymakers. And that's where I think the future of our field need to be happening. For us to be active in the ceasefire, we need to be able to have capacity in both sides for this engagement to be effective. Thank you.
Well, to all of my colleagues, the speakers, thank you so much. To those of you who stayed, thank you so much. What an exceptional way to wrap things up. A beautiful, logical presentation with that one question at the end for all of us. What are we offering? I think this needs to be something that we think about. We call all the time for people to pay attention to religion in a constructive way. But are we actually working together to offer solutions? That's the clarion call, I think, for those of us involved. Again, thank you so much. The Vice Minister had to leave. I would have offered her great appreciation. I wish we had time for questions and answers, but please track down these incredible practitioners and thinkers and corner them and ask them your own questions, because they're all wonderful people, even those of you who I just met. So thanks again to everybody. It's been a great panel. I really appreciate you all.